Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in. On this episode of the Treasury Update podcast, host Craig Jeffery leads a discussion with Jacqui Drew, head of sales and account management of Ion Treasury, on preparing for Libor replacement. They take an in-depth look at Libor, explore the situation that led to it, and cover replacement rates, the global impact on the market, and what organizations should be thinking about and how to prepare. Listen into the discussion.
Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast. This is Craig Jeffery, and today's episode is called Preparing for the Libor Replacement. And I'm here with Jacqui Drew. She's the head of sales and account management from Ion Treasury, and I'm delighted to have her with me. Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, Jacqui.
Thank you very much, Craig. Looking forward to talking to you.
Now, as we start and we talk about Libor, I was wondering if you could provide a little bit of background on Libor and the replacements to it. What's the situation that led to it? What is it? And I know there's some terms, so let's get those out on the table first.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Craig. So basically, Libor is the London Interbank Offered Rate, and it basically represents a collection of rates that's been published for over 30 years, so kind of starting since 1986. And actually was published across a number of different currencies, and is still published today, across a number of different currencies and across a number of different maturities. So hence the reason we actually use the RBOR as more of a generic term across the different currency pairs. As I say, it was started being published in 1986 and represented an average rate of a number of panel banks, published on a daily basis for multiple currencies and multiple maturities. But then in kind of 2008, at the time of the global financial crisis, there were a number of years that then there were investigations into the RBOR rates. And in 2012, many of the largest banks of the world were fined because of false reports and manipulations related to the RBOR rates. As a result of that, various regulatory bodies got involved, and they said that we need to look to alternative rates to replace RBOR. And the key focus was around looking for rates that represented actual transactional data rather than rates that could be manipulated because they were being supplied by the banks. And in 2017, the FCA announced that they were no longer going to compel banks or persuade them to submit quotes to support the London Interbank Offer Rate post-2021. So they looked to identify new alternative reference rates that could replace RBOR. And so that's where we are kind of over the last 18 months is we have looked to identify these new alternative reference rates. And we started with the 5 main currency pairs. And for each of those currency pairs, we have identified a new alternative reference rate. So that covers the United States, the United Kingdom, the Euro area, Switzerland, and Japan. And for each of those different jurisdictions, a new rate has been identified. So, for example, for the US, we have identified the SOFR rate as the new rate. For the UK, SONIA. Euro area, we've identified ESTA. And then Switzerland and Japan, SARON and TONA. And those are the new rates that have been identified to replace RBOR for those different jurisdictions.
So these are all female names for the replacement rates?
Yeah.
it almost sounds like that. Sorry. It's just Sonia, Esther. Very good. So these replacement rates cover the main areas and jurisdictions. So these new rate regimes are, like you said, they're no longer provided just by the banks. They're actually market traded rates. But what are the challenges of this? You know, you're using new rates. What issues can crop up with those, or what are we seeing in the early stages? Why does that matter? What should we be thinking about that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, Craig. So I think the key thing to note is that obviously, as you've seen, each jurisdiction has identified their new alternative reference rates. What's key and common amongst all of them is they are all overnight rates. But what's different is that each jurisdiction has come up with their own rate. So previously we had RBOR, which was, a consistent approach although it led to scandals. But it was a consistent approach across all jurisdictions. Whereas in this case, we have a different rate for each jurisdiction. So that comes with some challenges. First up is in terms of the rates that are actually being used. So if we look at the United Kingdom, for example, the rate that they've chosen is SONIA. SONIA has actually been around for many, many years. It's an actively traded rate. It's being used in a number of bond and loan issuances and has been used for swap trades as well for many years. However, if you look at SOFA, that was a brand new rate that was instituted as part of this IBOR reform. It actually only came into existence in 2018, and that's for the US market. And similarly for ESTA, for the European area, that's a brand new rate as well, and actually only came into existence this year, so in this last quarter of 2019. So that definitely poses some challenges as you've got some of these curves that have a lot of liquidity and a lot of history, and others that are brand new curves, and therefore they come in with a lot of lack of liquidity initially and perhaps also some volatility. The other key difference is that there is a mixture in terms of these rates. Are they secured or unsecured? So, for example, the SOFA rate is a secured rate versus SONIA and ESTA are unsecured rates. So that has some implications, particularly as we look to see how these markets develop, how different instruments are traded in those markets. And then ultimately, when you look at syndicated facilities, or you look at cross-currency swaps, they are going to have, potential impact in terms of how those instruments are priced and then resultantly how they're valued, because some are part of the underlying curve will be secured and part of the underlying curve will be unsecured. And then I guess, the other key difference is obviously because we've got different jurisdictions governing these rates, they have, different timelines, different protocols, and we're not seeing consistency across that. So that is causing some challenges in terms of how these rates are actually going to be applied and put into practice going forward.
Yeah, so getting back to the liquidity issue, you said some of them are fairly new and so they don't have the liquidity. What's the type of impact that has had or could have in the earlier goings of these, especially the newer rate regimes?
Yeah. Sure. So because, as I said, one of the key drivers of this change was for banks and for these rates to be based off of underlying transactions rather than an estimate or a judgment applied by the banks. It really means that they are driven by liquidity in the marketplace. As liquidity increases, then we expect to see, a longer term horizon in terms of how these rates are structured. We can see a lot more activity going on, and therefore that encourages more market participation as well. So certainly what we've seen, in the US market is a reluctance, particularly on the corporate side, to start entering into transactions referencing the new rate because there isn't much liquidity. And generally, I'd say corporate treasuries, are a bit nervous about being at the forefront of that and maybe not taking, steps to issue new trades of curves that are coming into place quite recently. So that's the first aspect. Although I will note that, liquidity is definitely increasing at an exceptional rate. So actually the ISDA publishes a quarterly report where they report on the number of trades referencing the new rates. And in particular for Q3, there was a 25% increase in the number of trades referencing SOFA from quarter two. And for SONIA, there was a 34% increase. So it is increasing at an alarming rate, and I think we'll certainly see that going forward as we move into 2020 as well. And therefore, the implications will be that we'll start to see, particularly on the corporate treasury side, more desire to enter into new trades that reference these underlying rates.
We did an earlier call. We talked about the sunset of Libor. When does Libor disappear?
Yeah, so that's $1 million question. In terms of, what's been provided, so the FCA announced in 2017 that they were no longer going to compel or persuade banks to submit quotes after 2021, so post December 2021. So in theory, post that date, Libor won't be around anymore. However, I think what we're seeing is that as liquidity in the new rate starts to increase, that naturally means that liquidity in IBOR will start to decrease. And so I think for some currency pairs, for some maturities, we might start to see that actually happening sooner because there's just not much liquidity in the RBOR rates, and therefore companies will transition over to the new reference rates. I think certainly as well, as companies go to market to get funding, they should definitely be asking themselves the question of, if I'm looking to take out a 5-year or 10-year loan, is it appropriate that I still have a loan that references RBOR, or should I be looking to reference the new rate? So I think that is also driving the liquidity up, and therefore will have an implication on when we actually see RBOR cease to exist. I think certainly, 9 months ago when we were preparing for our client connection events, a lot of people were saying that they still expect RBOR to be around and not necessarily fully cease. However, I think over the last 9 months, we've seen a change in perception. And, the message that I've seen communicated from various Big Four and other events is that you need to prepare that RBOR is definitely going to cease, because otherwise you could be left really short.
That makes a lot of sense. Anything else that we're learning with the new rates, or what you might expect to learn over the next short-term horizon?
Yeah, I think the banks being able to understand what these new rates mean, understanding the liquidity and really monitoring that. I think, as I said, that ISDA report is really useful to understand the liquidity and seeing how the number of trades are increasing. I do think we'll start to see more in terms of how these rates are going to interact with each other. So just actually last week, there was a report about a cross-currency swap that was referencing alternative rates on both sides, both of the currency pairs. And certainly as that market improves, then we'll see how those secured, unsecured rates are behaving, what are the basis swaps. But definitely, there's still lots to understand in terms of how these new reference rates are going to be used in practice. They are very different to RBOR in the sense that previously RBOR is a forward-looking rate versus the new alternative reference rates are backward-looking. So that has an implication in terms of, how you do your forecasts. At the moment, you could say, okay, this loan resets on a 3-monthly basis. Let me look at what is the projection for 3 months, and I can do all of my interest accruals and prepare everything on that basis using the rate that's been reset at the beginning of the period. However, with these new alternative reference rates, they're backward-looking, and typically most of them are overnightly compounded. So you only got to identify your rate at the end of the period, which has quite some significant implications from a settlements perspective, from a matching perspective. So I think the key thing for us is really understanding the wider implications. And I think some other areas that we'll talk about in a few minutes is, how does this actually impact accounting, hedge accounting, technology, all of those different areas as well.
I guess that does lead us to the section about what should we think and what should we do now. There's a couple elements. What should we think and do about secured versus unsecured? Is that an issue or not, or that's just subject to availability by creditors? What should we do with regard to some of these agreements we may have, like loan agreements? What's the impact on systems, impacts on trading? Like you said, you have to prepare for it because it's going away, so you at least have to have an alternative structured in there. So what are some of the things we should think about? Maybe start with the bank agreements or loan agreements.
Yeah, no, I think really, really key points there that you alluded to, Craig. I think one key aspect, even before you get stuck in the agreements, is really just understanding your exposure to RBOR. And I think this is where we've been able to have discussions with clients and kind of see light bulbs turning on when they realize and appreciate that it's not just, simple loan or debt agreements. The implications are actually really far-reaching. So some things to consider in terms of understanding where your RBOR exposure is to look across, your full portfolio. So understanding, any revenue contracts, leasing contracts, intercompany funding, syndicated facilities, anything that it has, potential for increases due to RBOR, whether they're penalty clauses, whether they're interest charges. Obviously, as we said, your standard loans and debt instruments, but then also anything that is held on the balance sheet at fair value. So that includes all of your derivative instruments. They're held on balance sheet at fair value, which means you're discounting, in most cases for corporates or for LIBOR-based curve. So that's going to have an impact. So even things like commodity derivatives will have an impact due to the RBOR replacements. So I think that's the first step for corporates and for everyone, is to really understand the full exposure. And in terms of that, really looking at the maturity of instruments. So, obviously if you've got things that are rolling off in the next year or so, perhaps not too much of an impact, but anything that extends post 2021, you really want to have a good understanding of where your exposure is. And then the second point, as you mentioned, is looking to understand what do your agreements actually say. And this, has proved quite interesting. A number of conferences that we've attended where, in some cases, many organizations have, all of their contracts just stored in physical format, so don't have the ability to search for ARBOR reference clauses. So that's, a key first step. And then really understanding what are the implications. And unfortunately, it seems there's a lot of contracts that don't necessarily talk about exactly what happens if ARBOR ceases to exist. There's often references to it might temporarily cease and therefore do X, Y, and Z. But there are some contracts that don't even refer to this possible situation which we're in now. And then similarly, in many cases where there are clauses in the contract which refers to this, sometimes it's just a simple sentence that says, go and talk to your financial advisor and ascertain what they suggest you do, which, is not entirely helpful when you have something as fundamental as replacing the whole of ARBOR. So definitely, obtaining contracts, understanding all of your exposures, and then really reading and understanding the language that's included in those contracts. And this is where, you're going to have to leverage multiple organizations or multiple departments within the organization. So having legal and tax involved is critical to really understand the language within those contracts and the implications thereof. That covers the, understanding the language. I think there's a number of implications that come from that. So, it might be as you're reading through the language in the contracts that you say, actually, this is a good time for us to renegotiate the contract. So use it as an opportunity to go to your bank and say, because of the ARBOR reform, I want to look at this contract in total, and we need to see what we need to change. How does this reference the new rates? What are the implications of that? What are the implications on our margin? And maybe actually it's a good time from a business perspective that you want to renegotiate some terms of that contract as well. I think the thing to be aware is that the banks might be doing the same on their side. So they might be coming to corporates and saying, it's a good chance for us to look at this contract and see if any terms need to be adjusted.
Yeah, so that renegotiation part, sure. Do you have any other advice besides making sure you're considering the new rates? Is there any specific suggestions you'd have?
Absolutely. So as, companies are going to market, they should definitely be looking to consider whether it is more suitable to enter into loan or funding reference in the new rates. And we've started to see that in very small doses more recently. So with a large port authority here in the UK has recently taken that approach. I think, it comes back to the point I earlier made, that corporate treasuries tend to be, maybe a bit reluctant and wanting to see where the market moves before they go out and execute that. But my advice would be that would definitely be something that you would consider, because you don't want to get into a situation that you go out and take out new funding, referencing ARBOR only for 1 year down the line. You're going to have to be re-looking that and changing the underlying reference rate and then potentially having an impact on your spread and your margins. So I definitely think it's worth, as you're looking to issue new instruments, consider whether it's appropriate to use the new rates. As I said, like for something like Sonia, that's a bit easier to do because there's lots of liquidity. Rates have been around for a long time. Maybe with Esther, we, a bit short of that, and that's to come in the next few months as and when the liquidity increases.
Yeah, maybe you could talk to the issues about technology systems, particularly as it relates to trading or hedge accounting. What are some of the challenges and what do we need to focus on there?
Particularly from a trading perspective, I guess majority of the time trading platforms are typically more used for FX instruments or, money market trades versus, if you're looking to execute a debt or loan agreement or an interest rate swap, that's more of a negotiation rather than a trading platform. But I guess the key thing is if you are entering deals in trading platforms, then you need to be able to get comfort that those trading platforms can cater to these new instruments. So So any deals that expecting to enter that are going to reference the new rates, you want to be able to know that you can trade those on the trading platforms. And then obviously, once you move through trading, if we think through the life cycle, confirmation, matching, and settlements, that's definitely going to be impacted as a result of these changes. So as I mentioned earlier, the way that interest accruals and subsequently the interest payments are going to be calculated as a different calculation and a different timing of that calculation as well. So it's going to put some changes involved in your actual process of issuing your remittance advices or receiving those from the banks and then getting that acknowledged within the solution, making sure that the solution can either have automatic feeds coming in from the market data providers or get updated really quickly to take into account those changes in terms of how the interest calculations are done. But from a technology perspective, and I'll cover this before I come on to the accounting and hedge accounting, there are a significant number of changes that need to be considered and taken into account by the technology vendors. So number one is just obviously being able to create the curve templates to support these new underlying instruments. So the way these curves are constructed is different, again, from an eyeball curve. The way that you bootstrap the underlying data that you use, the calculations are all different. So if you have a TMS that sources, input feeds from a Reuters or a Bloomberg, being able to have your curve structure set up correctly is of paramount importance. Obviously, if we have a TMS vendor that actually sources the market data and publishes that as part of the solution, then it's the same concept, but actually being able to source the data coming from these new curves like EFTA and SOFA. Related to that as well is the ability to calculate term rates, and that's particularly important when we look to come and calculate our interest rates in the future and do forecasting. There seems to be, there is some uncertainty exactly how those term rates will be constructed in the different jurisdictions. So we're definitely waiting on guidance from the regulators as to how those are actually going to be calculated and taking into account all of those calculations in the TMS. The second aspect is around being able to support new instruments. Although the underlying instruments will be the same, the actual mechanics of how these instruments are working is different. So I mentioned already, these are overnight rates compounded over the particular period. Some of them have, particular lockdown periods. Some of them have periods that the rate is frozen the last 5 days. So depending on how the contract is actually constructed, there might need to be changes in terms of the actual trade input screen and the calculations. The third area is really around, transition. So as we've spoken about, we expect that there will definitely be a push to enter into new instruments referencing the new rates, but definitely there's going to be a point in time at which you need to transition all of your existing contracts over from eyeball to the new alternative reference rates. And so key within the technology vendors and the solutions is being able to make that transition as easy as possible for corporates, but also to maintain the history. Obviously, we need to keep the history that this trade reference eyeball, from 2000 until 2020, and then from 2020, it's referencing a new rate. And being able to keep that history from an audit perspective, but also from a control perspective as well. And I think that's a key challenge within a number of the solutions to be able to develop that and facilitate the ease of transition for corporate clients. And then coming on to the fourth area, which is really around the implications on accounting, hedge accounting, credit valuation adjustments. To be honest, this is an area that requires a lot more from the market in terms of what's going to be required. We're definitely waiting for the ISB and the FASB, which are the two accounting regulatory bodies, to come out with some guidance, as they did with kind of their phase one of transition relief provisions. But we're expecting some more guidance to come out from those two regulatory bodies, as well as supported, I guess, by the Big Four, who might come out with, the interpretations of those requirements. And I think the implications are going to be, fairly significant that companies need to be having a think about. They really need to assess their portfolio, understand the implications of this on their portfolio, and then adjust their related accounting and hedge accounting accordingly.
You've talked a little bit about some of the preparation that people need to do, but maybe you could just give a summary of what type of plan do you recommend that people have? What are some of the key elements? We talked about, what's going on, volatility, everything from exposures to contracts to accounting. What should we be doing and thinking about? Some of the highlights.
Yeah, sure. So actually we've spoken about it in kind of three different phases. So an exploration phase, a planning phase, and then an execution phase. So in the exploration phase, really, understanding your full exposure to ARBOR, so doing an initial impact assessment across the organization, across your contracts to understand what is your impact, reviewing your contracts for any fallback provisions, keeping up to date with the various regulatory bodies. For example, ISDA is coming out with some standard fallback provisions, and really setting up a team, so who's going to take ownership of this within the organization, and what departments do you need to have collaboration from. So to date, we've typically seen it being run from Treasury, but working with the likes of legal, tax, accounting, and perhaps even like supply chain procurement as well. So that's in the exploration phase, and I suspect majority of corporate clients are within that phase. Then we suggest our clients that you kind of move onto a planning stage. And this is really where you start to understand your exposure in more quantitative methods. So understanding, the implication of your sensitivity to ARBOR as liquidity drops, how much of an impact is that going to have on your portfolio? Looking at the liquidity in the new alternative reference rates, is that a driver for you to transition some of your projects or products over to the new alternative reference rates? As you look for funding, over the next 3 to 5 years, what funding is going to be best and more suited for the organization, and perhaps using it as an opportunity or responding to banks in terms of renegotiation. So really looking at your overall sort of hedging strategy, what are your policies, and really what is the exposure that the company is willing to take in the light of ARBOR ceasing to exist post-2021. And then the final stage is really execution. And that's obviously where you're going out, engaging with your banks, with your consultants, reviewing your technology across the Treasury landscape. So dealing platforms, confirmation systems, accounting systems, Treasury management systems, speaking to all of your vendors, understanding their plans and their program, and developing a program internally for transitioning away from ARBOR. As I say, I think we see our clients in different levels of these three different stages, with the majority of them being in the exploration stage. But I think as we move into 2020, those key areas are going to be vital for companies to be considering.
Jacqui, as we look at the calendar going forward, I guess a couple of questions come to mind as we draw this episode to a close. When should we next check in on this topic? And what are some of the calendar things that are interesting to you as you look at either the market or things that you have to do as a system developer?
Yeah, great, Craig. I think 2020 is going to be a big year for us. I think there's going to be lots that's going to happen. So, in terms of the right time to check in, I would say, kind of getting towards the end of Q1 next year. Certainly from our perspective, we're planning on doing significant amount of development across our Treasury solutions in 2020. We have already started and done a huge amount of development, but we'll be doing more in 2020. We are waiting, as I alluded to earlier, for the accounting provisions coming from the ISB and the FASB. I think that's a key focus for us, and particularly seeing how the Big Four interpret the guidelines that come out. And so we're expecting that, I understand, was initially scheduled for the end of the year, but I think that's now looking more closer to beginning of next year. So we'll be keeping an eye on that, and then ascertaining what kind of implications that has on our technology systems. And definitely we're starting to see a lot more corporates engaged on this topic. So we're starting to have more interactive discussions with our clients to understand where they are in their process, and learning from our clients as well as what they're looking for, support that's needed. So we're anticipating more of those discussions in the beginning of Q1, and that will also drive our development going forward.
Well, Jacqui, I want to thank you for your time and input on this great topic. It seems like if people aren't preparing for LIBOR replacement, which is the bulk of them, that exploring, they're planning, or they're moving towards execution. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Craig. Thanks for having me.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.